All right, everybody good? All good? Okay, all right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you all for coming out today. I know it was hard to get off Twitter, but I promise this will be much more healthy for your emotional well-being. Here at AEI, we are interested in the strengths of and the stresses on the American family and the way that those, in turn, affect our civic health. The impact of technology on our families is one of the most pressing issues facing many of us as parents, as teachers, and policymakers. And so we will try to look at this issue today from a number of different angles with our great panel. I'm very excited about this. 2018 actually brought a major shift, I think, in our attitudes toward technology, a techlash, if you will. And today we're going to assess that shift and see what the future holds. In 2014, when I wrote a book about the need to restrict the amount of time that our kids spend on screens, the idea was not a very popular one, at least not in my community. The research that I had done had persuaded me to set a tight policy for my own then all elementary school children. No television or playing tablets on weekdays, a couple of hours on weekends, no smartphones until they are at least teenagers. I hadn't decided on social media yet, but I'd be fine with them getting driver's licenses first, frankly. To say that other parents thought that my rules were draconian would be an understatement. Bonkers is probably a little more accurate. But things, I think, started to shift. After a week like this, frankly, I'm feeling a lot less countercultural these days. I traced the tech backlash to the end of 2017 with the publication, many of you probably read, of Jean Twenge's Atlantic article, Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation? It spread through the mommy blogosphere like wildfire. You could actually watch as the social media conversation moved from iPads are just like comic books to why, wait, are those suicide numbers so high? But an even broader culture shift began in April when Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg testified before Congress. It seemed to finally dawn on our political leaders and the mothers and the fathers watching the hearings that something was seriously amiss about the business plan of Facebook. Collecting and selling personal data about us and our children seemed like it was going to be more of a problem than we thought. No surprise then that the big five, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, lost about $1 trillion in the fourth quarter last year. Anyone paying even a little bit of attention last year would have run into news about how tech executives themselves were working hard to keep their own kids off screens. An employee of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative told the New York Times, "The devil is in our phones and it is wreaking havoc on our children." And the former editor of Wired compared screens to crack cocaine. I think there's even bipartisan agreement on this issue now. According to an Axios survey from November 2017 to 2018, the portion of Democrats who believe social media was hurting democracy and free speech went from 37 to 48%, and the percentage of Republicans who thought that went from 52 to 69%. In October, you had the release of the study of 4,500 children ages 8 to 11 in the Lancet Journal of Adolescent Health, the Adolescent Health and Medical Journal. It found that limiting kids' screen time was linked to better cognition. But of course, a lot of research has come out in the last 5 years suggesting that screens are not great for kids' emotional, social, and intellectual development. And the interviews that I did for my book, I actually found that most parents actually had a gut sense that this was true. A Pew Research Center survey from August found that 65% of parents say their kids spend too much time on devices. And actually, the kids agree. 54% of teens say they spend too much time on their cell phones. 41% say they spend too much time on social media. And more than half of teens associate the absence of their cell phone with at least one of these three emotions: loneliness, being upset, or feeling anxious. The parents I interviewed were actually not waiting for more longitudinal studies on screen time before deciding to enact restrictions. They were simply expressing frustration that they could not do more to control it. According to that Pew survey in August, even though parents see the dangers and more than half of teens say they have tried to reduce their own screen time, only 57% of parents report setting any restrictions on their kids' use of screens. This is not surprising. There are obviously many forces pushing us to give our kids technology, from the technology companies themselves to our schools, our friends, and the culture at large. Our family structure has changed, and so has our style of parenting. As we have fewer children, there are fewer children in any home to entertain each other. A couple of years ago, my son had a friend over, and a few minutes after he walked in, he came over to me and said he was bored. "Do you have a device?" he asked, to which I replied, "You are the device." which is to say, if I wanted to give my son a device, I wouldn't need him there. Though our kids may bicker, it is generally more fun and interesting when there are more kids around, which is why it is so problematic that there are so few kids playing outside in our neighborhoods, and no parent wants to send their child out to play alone. Our own helicopter parenting has, of course, created the problem too. Not only do we think it's unsafe for our kids to be outside alone, but we also can't bear for them to be bored or uncomfortable. We want them to be stimulated in some way all the time, and not surprisingly, that's what they get used to. Giving into technology happens so fast. One day we are wondering about whether an hour of Sesame Street is a good habit for a 2-year-old, and the next minute it seems we have adolescents who won't look up from their phones long enough to have a conversation with us. The screen situation is getting away from us, but I don't think now is the time for guilt about what we've done. It's time to take a deep breath and look at where we are, at where our children are, and where we want our families to be. A 2015 survey commissioned by Common Sense Media found that tweens between the ages of 8 and 12 are spending more than 5 hours a day consuming digital media. Teens are spending almost 8 hours a day. That's not including listening to music and not including any screen time for homework. So what does that mean? I have a friend named Laura Vanderkam who writes about time management. She's fond of saying, time is a choice. I don't have time means it's not a priority. When we think of all the things that we don't have, that our kids don't seem to have a spare minute to do, time to play outside, to see their friends, to read a book for pleasure, to talk to their mom about their day, hint, hint. It's worth remembering that they are spending several hours a day watching videos, browsing websites, texting friends, and checking in on social media. Over the years, a number of parents have surreptitiously asked me, how do you do it? They tell me that their kids bug them, quote, all the time to play on tablets and phones. It's surprising to me because these same parents seem capable of moderating all sorts of other aspects of their kids' lives. It's all about setting expectations and being consistent. If my kids pestered me as much as their kids did, I would also lose my mind. But my kids don't actually ask me about screens all the time. They actually don't ask me for chocolate cake for breakfast either, because they already know the answer, most of the time. Oops. I think that the number of parents who are setting restrictions for kids on their screens is actually going to rise. Parents who want to reduce their kids' screen time now are starting to have the culture on their side when it comes to making the right call. Less time with the phone or the gaming system, and more face-to-face interaction, more time outside, more physical activity, more family dinners, more book readings, more board games. I think the zeitgeist is really shifting here, and so we can take advantage of it. But with that, I would like to introduce our great panel today. First, we're going to hear from Brad Wilcox. He is a visiting scholar at AEI, where he directs the Home Economics Project, inaugurated in the fall of 2013. It explores the links between family structure and economic growth. He is also an associate professor at the University of Virginia, where he directs the National Marriage Project. Then we're going to hear from Brooke Shannon. She is the founder and executive director of Wait Until 8th, an organization that encourages parents to delay giving their children smartphones until 8th grade. And then we're going to hear from Christine Emba. She is an opinion columnist and editor for the Washington Post, and she was previously the Hilton Kramer Fellow in Criticism at the New Criterion and a deputy editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit. And finally, we're going to hear from Christine Rosen. She is a senior editor of The New Atlantis, where she writes about the intersection of society and technological change. So with that, thank you. I'll turn it over to Brad.
Thanks for introducing us, Naomi. I'm going to begin actually by going on a little bit of a detour for us today. I think we're going to focus primarily on the impact of technology on kids and on teenagers. But I want to sort of address for a few minutes sort of how technology is shaping us as adults and sort of do that with reference to some trends both in marriage and in relationship quality more generally. Just looking here for my slides. Okay. And I think probably many of you are aware of some research that suggests the rise of kind of the screen culture that Naomi was referencing just a few minutes ago is perhaps linked to some pretty dramatic changes in sort of how we relate to one another in person. So sort of what's happening online is affecting kind of our in-person relationships. And so there's been reports of declines in dating, for instance, the Jean Twenge's research that Naomi just touched upon. We have seen, too, work indicating, my own and others, that sex is down in America among both adults in general, but also among younger adults and actually also teens, and that marriage is down. And that part of the story here may be the way in which kind of the quality of our electronic entertainment is discouraging us from spending time with others, including romantic time, including sex, and also, of course, that can have implications too for marriage as well. So I want to talk today, though, about a new survey that was just fielded by YouGov with a colleague of mine, Jeffrey Dew. And this is the iFidelity survey, and it's looking at a wide range of relationship outcomes here in America. And one thing that allows us to do is kind of look at both the impact of the quantity of time that adults are spending with their screens, but also to kind of think about how different kinds of activities may be linked to relationship outcomes for adults in the U.S. And what we're doing in this particular sort of survey right now is just looking sort of at the impact of virtual entertainment and activities on relationship quality. And what this survey shows us, among other things, is that married adults are more likely to be flourishing compared to cohabiting couples in the quality of the relationships. We also can look, too, at the associations between the quantity of time people are spending and the categories that they're spending time on. And what we're finding, actually, surprisingly, in this particular survey is that there is not a statistically significant difference in relationship quality for men and for women, just based simply on the amount of time that people are spending on their screens. And that was, frankly, a surprise to me. But we did find that when you look at different activities, when you ask people to kind of sort of specify what are their top 3 activities in terms of things like gaming or email or news or pornography or social media, that there is a link between particular types of activity and relationship quality for some of our respondents. And it turns out that women actually didn't have, any kind of association here between these different activities and the quality of the relationships. But 2 different activities for men were linked to worse outcomes. One of those is gaming, and one of those is pornography. So we can see first, when you look at kind of just the gaming story, what you can see here is that men who are naming gaming as a top screen activity are less likely to be in that sort of top category for relationship quality here in America. And a couple of different ideas about why that might be the case. One is that if guys are spending a lot of time playing games, playing video games of one sort or another, that may kind of pose a direct threat to their ability to spend time with their spouse or their partner, especially if these are not kind of couple games. A second point is that it also may sort of foster an orientation, that is gaming, towards kind of stimulation and entertainment that isn't conducive to making kind of the small sacrifices that are required for family life and for relationships. So you may be, for instance, less inclined to take out the trash or do the dishes or, clean, the laundry if you're really into gaming, is sort of one idea. And that would have, obviously, important implications for the quality of your relationship. There could also be kind of a selection effect here, too, where the kinds of men who continue to play lots of games even after they're cohabiting or even after they've gotten married just aren't the kinds of men who are going to be, good husbands or good partners more generally. But the bottom line here in terms of this particular finding is there's some kind of negative link between kind of prioritizing gaming for guys and enjoying a higher quality relationship, be they married or cohabiting. And then we also find in the survey, as others have found in different studies, there's a negative link between sort of naming pornography as a top activity and the quality of relationships. And that's pretty evident here on the screens behind me. So again, men who are sort of indicating that pornography is a top activity for them online are less likely to enjoy the highest quality relationships, both in terms of cohabiting and married men. And we could think probably of a number of explanations for why this might be the case. For me, 2 came to mind. One is that pornography may kind of encourage men to have expectations when it comes to sort of sex and romance that are either not realistic or that may not kind of correspond what their partners are looking for when it comes to the bedroom. So that's sort of one idea. A second idea, too, is that pornography may kind of encourage men to sort of take an approach to their relationships, including to sex, that is sort of more self-oriented, more about their own personal pleasure rather than being more attentive to sort of both the physical and the emotional needs of their partner. But again, the bottom line here is that if men are naming pornography as one of their top activities, they are less likely to be enjoying a high-quality relationship. Now, just quickly, there are some important limitations here. We don't know the direction of causality here. And again, it could be the kinds of men who are drawn to gaming in a big way or who are drawn to pornography in a big way are just the kinds of men who aren't as likely to enjoy a high-quality relationship. So that's certainly, I think, one big story here. And then also, I think when it comes to kind of the gaming story, I haven't actually seen much on the impact of gaming and relationships in other studies. And so we'd like to sort of see that finding replicated in other research. But if the story that I'm telling here is a true one, this merits concern, right? Because we know that gaming is on the rise and that pornography is on the rise, and that they're both playing a pretty important role in the lives of many teenage boys and in the lives of many young men as well. So this could lead us. These results could lead us to be, again, sort of a little bit fearful about how technology is playing a role in our society and in particular in our relationships here in the U.S. So as we kind of go forward, I think we need to think carefully about how not just sort of the quantity of time people are spending online might matter, but also kind of how particular activities may be consequential for their relationships. And to think, too, about how for men in particular, lots of gaming and pornography may pose, a risk, a challenge when it comes to enjoying high-quality relationships down the road and also in their marriages going forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to the next panelist.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here today. I recently shared with my father-in-law that I was going to be at AEI, and he was beyond proud that his daughter-in-law was going to be here. He is a Georgetown alum, and he loves DC, and he loves AEI. So it was this big moment for me as a daughter-in-law. And after I got off the phone with him, I started to reflect a little bit about my journey that has brought me here today. If you would have told me a couple years ago that I'd be speaking before you today about the reasons to delay technology for your children, I would have been a little bit surprised. At the time, I had a third grader, a second grader, and a preschooler, all girls. And I was just starting to feel the pressure to cave to my children's technology desires. A few kids in my daughter's third grade class had recently gotten new iPhones. And even a couple of kids in my daughter's second grade class had gotten shiny new phones as well. And needless to say, the pressure was on, and the campaign in the Shannon household was in full effect. And every few days, we heard the same question: when are we getting a smartphone, Mom? Can we get a smartphone for Christmas? Sally has a smartphone. Susie has a smartphone. Can we get a smartphone for my birthday? For Columbus Day, you name it. They were asking, can we get a smartphone? And I kept saying, not yet. The timing did not feel right. They seemed far too young, and I just wasn't ready to grant the smartphone wish. I knew it would come with a lot of challenges. Well, the campaigning went on for several months, and one day I was driving past my daughter's future middle school, and the kids were coming out from the school day, and what I noticed was that all heads were down. No children were speaking to one another. They were all completely captivated by their online world. And as a mom, this was discouraging to see that this is what middle school was going to look like for my girls unless something changed. I knew in my gut that by the time middle school rolled around, that either they would be one of the only kids with their heads up or they would have a smartphone in their hands. So that afternoon, I emailed around 20 parents or so from my daughter's third grade class just to take people's temperature. Started asking, what are you thinking about smartphones? Have you done this already? What are you thinking on this important issue? And what I heard was a lot of concerns. A lot of moms were worried about kids having them for so many hours a day at such a young age. They were worried about the inappropriate content they could access on them. They were hesitant about the social pressure that came with them. But what I heard over and over again was that eventually the pressure to have one gets to be too much because it starts to feel like every kid in your child's grade has one of these devices, and you don't want your kid to be left out of social situations. You don't want them to feel isolated or ostracized. So we kept talking and brainstorming, and then this idea came up of, what if we said not yet together? What if we trusted that there would be strength in numbers and strength in community? And we decided to rally together and hold off on giving our children smartphones as a group until a certain age. Now, at this point, we weren't exactly sure what that magical age should be, and we started to research the issue a little more. And what we found across the board, from child psychologists to internet safety experts to even technology executives themselves, was that the recommended age to give children a smartphone was somewhere between 14 and 16 years old. Now, in our own community, we were seeing kids as young as 7 years old with these devices, so holding off to 16 did not seem feasible, but 14 seemed within reach. So that would be within the recommended age bracket, and it would be somewhat doable. So 14 is around 8th grade, and the Wait Until 8th pledge was born. We put the pledge online, and we shared it with some other families from our school and our school district. And the pledge quickly grew from this idea between a group of moms to this national movement. It turns out that there were so many other communities out there that were wrestling with the same issue that we were. And people started to sign the pledge from across the country. Now, several months into the pledge, a widely publicized Atlantic article that Naomi mentioned earlier, Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation, alarmed parents and the media across the country. And the author linked the rise of smartphone usage and social media usage to the uptick in anxiety, loneliness, depression, and even suicide for children. In the midst of this article going viral, I started to get some pretty exciting calls. The Today Show, Good Morning America, NPR, and even USA Today wanted to know a little bit more about this pledge that we had started in Texas. And this media interest created a lot of buzz around the pledge and lots of pledges coming in. Over the next 18 months, more news stories came out highlighting the risk of giving young children smartphones. We learned that smartphones are an academic distraction and that the mere presence of a phone in the classroom, even if it's turned off, can distract from learning. We also learned that elementary-age children who receive a smartphone are more likely to be involved in cyberbullying versus children who receive smartphones later in childhood. Communities were shaken with children as young as 8 years old taking their own lives after relentless social media pressure and cyberbullying. And news story after news story detailed children were being exposed to pornography, sexting, and even sex trafficking by the access they had online through a smartphone. Journalists, scientists, and even technology executives started to talk about this idea that smartphones and the apps that are on smartphones could be addictive. And a former Google manager, Tristan Harris, even went as far as to compare smartphones as slot machines in children's pockets. What was clear from this steady stream of news was that the conveniences of smartphones do not outweigh the risk for children. Many parents agreed and signed the Wait Until 8th pledge. Today, close to 20,000 families are delaying the smartphone until 8th grade, and I think this number will continue to rise in 2019. We were recently granted our 501c3 status and are about to start some fundraising for some much-needed resources to help build awareness about the pledge. Until now, the pledge has been fueled purely by passion and by word of mouth. There's a lot of untapped potential out there that was limited before by limited resources. While the pledge is very vibrant in certain pockets of the country, there is so much ground to be covered in building awareness about this issue. We believe that if families simply know that this resource is out there, that more will jump on board. And our hope is to grow the 20,000 pledges to 1 million over time and eventually increase the national age a child receives a smartphone. Currently, that average is only 10 years old. We also hope to develop a curriculum program of sorts for families that have waited until at least 8th grade or beyond to help them move into the next chapter and teach them how to use smartphones safely, appropriately, and moderately. Lastly, we want to help collaborate with parents to encourage schools to have strong smartphone policies. Many schools are contributing to the immense pressure that families are feeling on children having smartphones at a certain age. Some schools are flat out asking children to bring phones to school for quote-unquote learning purposes, while other schools are far too lenient in letting children have smartphones out in the middle of class to do social media scrolling and even playing Fortnite in the middle of class. We want to help change this because we know from research that when phones are out, grades go down and bullying goes up. The future is full of so much potential for this movement, and the journey has been an exciting ride from having the morning shows in my home to being with you today. But the most rewarding part of this work for me is that my 5th grader will start middle school in the fall. And I know when that bell rings in the fall, she will come out and she and 60 other kids will have their heads up and they won't have smartphones in their hands. And the following year, my middle daughter is going to start middle school too, and she too will have 60 peers waiting with her until at least 8th grade. Almost 500 families have signed the pledge in our own little school district and are waiting until at least 8th grade. There is such strength in numbers, and we want more communities to rise up and link arms together around this important issue. Because after all, childhood is too short to waste on a smartphone. Thank you.
I have to admit that I walked up here with my own smartphone in my back pocket, and it has been buzzing regularly. But as my own pushback against this technologically advanced world, I will not be using slides, and I also won't check my phone. So I graduated from college not that long ago, from Princeton. I think I got my first smartphone perhaps my senior year of college, or maybe the year afterwards. My younger sister, however, got her first smartphone in middle school. And she's a college freshman now, at my own alma mater. Because I'm a nosy older sister, obviously, I ask her about her activities, whether she goes out, etc., etc. She told me a story that I found positively alarming. So at Princeton, students go out on the weekends to what are called eating clubs. You meet up with friends, you can dance on the dance floor, you can drink a beer or two if you're of age, which my sister assures me that she never has. Obviously, I don't believe her. And in my day, eating clubs were a social hub. You would go there to maybe flirt with that cute guy who you'd met in your bio lab. You would go with your group of girlfriends and merge with other friends on the dance floor. You might leave with a phone number or even plans for a date. But her story shocked me because she said that when they went to eating clubs together, they would swipe. They would be on Tinder. They would go out to the street, go to a club surrounded by other students, stand along the wall by themselves and swipe through matches. And when they matched with someone who they liked, they would pick up and leave and go meet that person somewhere or say that they'd meet the next day. This freaks me out. I said, aren't you standing next to new people? Isn't the whole point of, being in a public space to talk to friends and meet people? Yeah, she said, but, talking to strangers is weird. Okay, so where does one go from there? This story's anecdotal, but I have every reason to believe that it's a sign of the times. I mean, it's even a factor in my own millennial life. There's no such thing as the grocery store meet cute anymore. As a single person, I'm sad to say. The Whole Foods grocery line is now a place where people listen to podcasts on their phones by themselves. Adults, of course, can do whatever they want. And it's not that I want my little sister to be kissing near strangers on the dance floor. But I do worry about the onset of this phone-mediated socialization and what that is doing to younger generations. Millennials and Generation Z are the groups that communicate by screens more and in person less. I think we're the first generation in which that has flipped, that we're primarily communicating on screens. And there are upsides to this, or at least interesting aspects. But there are also clear downsides. Screen time can lead to arrested social development, especially in young people who already experience some sort of social anxiety or anxiety in general. And of course, as we know, millennials and Gen Z are now known to be the most anxious generation ever. Over 62% of undergrads have reported overwhelming anxiety about their school, work, or lives, according to the American College Health Association. Now, in the past, a strong desire to belong to a social group in adolescence would, force teens and young people to overcome some of this anxiety, or at least try and push through it, to override that desire to stay at home and go out and make friends. But one of the original boons of technology and of the internet in general was that for those awkward kids or young people who don't want to meet in person, who have their own interesting and specific hobbies, they can get those needs met online. So they aren't forced into that socialization as they were in the past. And yes, that has upsides itself. The promise of the internet was to connect us to other people. And teens, young adults, college freshmen, college students in general, are exploring their identities. They're developing their tastes. They're learning. Screens can be a boon. They go on Tumblr and talk about their favorite movies or shows or characters. They explore and present new identities on Instagram and social media. But then the flip side to that is that they're easily influenced. And it's an easily influenced age. What we see on screens counts, for better or for worse. So if you're on social media or Tinder, what's real? What should you be aiming for? What should life look like? For teens and young people who are spending all of their time on screens, on phones, online, that can be skewed. So you have things like pornography, which Brad, I think, scared us enough about in his presentation already. But even when you're talking about dating, the impact of dating through a mediated app like a Tinder or a Bumble, something where you're swiping, does contribute to a culture of disposability, the idea that you can always move to the next person. What does that say about their future in relationships? But what can we actually do about this? Especially when adolescents or teens are already out of the home at college or about to leave. I mean, if they want to communicate in this way, shouldn't we respect them and acclimate? Just because my mom is not fluent in the language of Instagram stories does not mean that I will not make them. And it's easier, after all, I think, if you're a parent. Just let your kid explore. But I think what you can do, actually, is urge the opposite and model it. This is pretty simple. It's analog, you might say, but it's also the most effective action that I think parents, peers, and even siblings can take. Social awkwardness, social anxiety, making friends, talking to new people. How do you learn to do that? As parents, You talk. So yes, your child might have a smartphone, they might have a screen, but you can talk to them. You can talk to other people. You can be the person who reaches out in the grocery store line. You can practice living in these public and social spaces in a real way so that your children know how to do that and know that it's possible. You can also encourage settings and activities that encourage the reciprocal in-person conversations that are often missing in screen time. So yes, playing Fortnite is one thing. You might be chatting with someone over a headset. But what if you urge your children, your adolescents, your teens, to join sports teams, to join clubs, to go to things in person? Again, this is where real life is learned and modeled. Screens are out there. They're coming for your kids. They've already gotten me. But the real world exists too. And I think that a parent's job is to teach their kid to live in it. Thanks.
We were joking before we started that we all felt a little bit like we were on the set of a Black Mirror episode because it's so very futuristic up here. And so I'll take us a little further into the dystopian future. I think one of the things we've been doing really well so far today is talking about the responsibilities both of individual users of personal technologies and, more importantly, parents. What do we owe our children? And that's the correct thing to do. We, as parents in particular, we do have an obligation to protect our children from things that could harm them. And one of the clear things that I think all the panelists have brought up so far are some of the opportunity costs of spending so much time looking at screens. Even if you're learning, even if you're having fun playing a video game, even if you're chatting with your friends, you're not doing other things. You're not, as you mentioned, you're not in the real world. You're not learning how to interact with other human beings. But I want to raise another issue, and that's what parents, what all of us, in fact, are actually up against here. We already know, and especially in the last year or so with some of the leaks and criticisms of big tech, we know that big tech has for a long time been angling for ever younger viewers, right? Facebook's Messenger app originally was targeting 5-year-olds. They want people to get onto their platforms as young as possible and stay hooked and basically live their online lives on those platforms. If you look at YouTube, for example, it's full of videos that draw in younger viewers. I'm sure all of you know a kid who loves to watch other kids play video games. You know, we all know about this, right? This is now old news. Tons of kids watching other kids do esports. And there's a huge amount of data exhaust that emerges from kids' use of these platforms and of social media. Also, I might add, of a lot of the educational software and technology that's used in schools. I challenge anyone whose kids are using programs in their local schools to ask to see the disclosure statement about what third parties have access to that data about their children. You will throw your school administrators into several sleepless nights, I know, because I did this, and it's extremely difficult to find out that information, right? As we know from some of the recent testimony of Facebook and Google executives before Congress, even adults find it difficult to know just precisely how much information some of these big technology companies have about us. So you can imagine it's even more difficult to protect your children in terms of what these companies know about our kids, what they're selling to advertisers and the like. That's all a story that we've heard before. But let me ask, how many of you have ever been in a casino? Anyone? Yeah. So you go into a casino, you're like, look at these people. They're like staring glassy-eyed at the slot machine. But if you look at how a casino is designed, it's perfectly designed to keep you there, right? There's no windows. There are few clocks. You don't know how much time is passing. And the machines themselves are designed to keep you playing, right? There's a wonderful scholarly book called Addiction by Design by a sociologist who spent a lot of time studying the machines themselves, machine gambling, and why it's so addictive. And it actually is addictive because it's designed to be addictive, not just by software engineers and computer engineers, but by psychologists and people with an expertise in human behavior. So I want to talk about that a little bit because there's a whole field called persuasive design or persuasive technology that doesn't get talked about a lot, and particularly in these debates about addiction. And I think parents in particular feel a lot of guilt about, why is my son screaming to play Fortnite after I told him he has to put it away? Or why did I have to lock up the Xbox because my kids can't stop playing it? It's not just that parents are bad parents or that your kids have problems. It's that these technologies are designed to keep you playing. I've been following the work of a man named B.J. Fogg. Has anyone heard of this guy? There's a reason you haven't heard of B.J. Fogg. He runs a lab at Stanford University called the Persuasive Technology Lab. And for years, I would just kind of, occasionally read updates about what he was doing, the kind of graduate student work that his students were doing. And I was always a little disconcerted by some of his statements. Their motto is machines designed to change humans. I'm like, that seems to get things backwards, right? This is really, there was an embrace of using technology to alter human behavior in a significant way, to get people to do things that I guess the designers at the Persuasive Technology Lab think they should be doing. There was very little, in fact, there was no discussion of ethical questions. Is this what we should be doing? How should we be doing this? Instead, there's a lot of boasting. B.J. Fogg gave an interview and he said, already my students are out in the world working our persuasive magic. The co-founder of Instagram was a B.J. Fogg grad student. So if you love Instagram, one of the reasons you love it is that one of his graduate students learned how to manipulate you to stay on Instagram as much as possible when they were a grad student in his lab. Now, look, this is fine. And in the last few years, what I've noticed the lab doing is taking down some of their more, let's say, they would probably see them as utopian. I saw them as dystopian statements about how they're going to alter human behavior. And there's a lot more kind of kinder, gentler rhetoric about we're going to do so much good in the world by just using technology to get people to stop doing this thing and instead do that thing. And it's, people are going to be thinner and happier and sleep more. It's going to be wonderful. So it's a lot more kind of wellness rhetoric than there used to be, which I think is an interesting change. But what they are really doing and what the big tech companies are hiring out of labs like Fogg's and others that study persuasive technology are how to use psychology, what we know about human behavior, to get people to do things, if you're a big tech company, to make you money, to get them to do things, to stay on your platform. So we all know this, right? That's what likes and follows do. It rewards you for staying on a platform, and the rewards do not come in a consistent way, so you have to keep checking back. Video game design does this extremely well. The reason, especially your teenage male kids want to stay on play Fortnite forever is that they're constantly being rewarded and they're gaining a sense of accomplishment, a genuine sense of accomplishment by playing this game and getting to the next level and playing with their friends. And if you look at social media, that has been designed to persuade you that social acceptance on that platform is what you should always be seeking. But this is where I think our focus on let's get every kid to code, let's learn all these STEM subjects, overlooks something really important about Silicon Valley, and that's that neuroscience, behavioral psychology are just as central to what they are designing and what we're consuming and what we're putting in front of our kids at ever younger ages. And B.J. Fogg did give an interesting interview recently where he said, someone asked him about, how do you persuade people to just, not eat junk food, eat healthy food, to exercise more and whatnot. And he said, the missing link isn't technology, it's always psychology. So you can see that even the most advanced technologists are always keeping in mind human behavior. The reason this is worrisome rather than reassuring is that there's no ethical underpinning to how they assess what human beings should be doing. There's profit motive, there's innovation motive, there's very little in terms of ethical discourse. So I'll just leave you with a few examples that hopefully we can talk a little bit more about in the Q&A. So there was a memo that was leaked, an internal Facebook document in 2017. An Australian newspaper received this document, and it was one of the things that Facebook sends out to the advertisers it's trying to get to use to advertise on Facebook. And it was an extremely granular, very detailed look at what Facebook could promise advertisers they could give them. And it was specifically designed at young Facebook users, the very youngest users, even ones who are probably on Facebook but don't meet the age requirement. And one of the things that Facebook told potential advertisers it could tell them about Facebook users, young users, is that they could track their feelings almost in real time. And the feelings that Facebook thought were the most central for advertisers to know about were things like feelings of insecurity, worthlessness, failure. These were the things that Facebook felt, there's our cash cow, right? This is what these people are going to want to target. Because if you're feeling bad, maybe an ad for a funny comedy that's coming out next week could appear on your feed. So you can see that it's the difficult, challenging human emotions like anger, like fear, like failure that they feel advertisers should be tapping into. And advertisers are doing this. This should worry us not only because of the data we have about screen use of adults, but that a lot of what kids are doing online now is a form of entertainment, right? It's video gaming. I consider social networking that teenagers do a form of entertainment for them. And they spend on average now, it's like 8 hours a day in front of some form of screen. It's a lot of time. But the companies that create these platforms only profit from getting your attention. And for children in particular, especially for teenagers, attention is a difficult thing to tame, right? I mean, I have two 12-year-old boys, and it's like, over here, come on, we're talking. I mean, it's funny. Kids who were extremely focused when they were 8, when they turned 12 or 13, it's suddenly, what happened to your brain? It's wandering. So I'll leave you with a warning from that long time ago, the 20th century. In 1957, there was a book called The Hidden Persuaders. Does anyone know this book? By Vance Packard. So this was a moment when, it was sort of the Mad Men era of advertising, and a lot of people started to grow concerned that advertising had a pernicious effect on human behavior and on society. So Vance Packard wrote this somewhat hyperbolic book about motivational researchers who are working for advertisers, and they're going to, basically brainwash you to buy, the right kind of dish soap or whatever. People were really alarmed by this. They were worried that subliminal messages were being flashed on televisions, which were, going into more and more American homes. There was a real concern about this and a real pushback against what messages advertising was doing. I would posit that what the smartphones that we all carry around and that our kids use and the platforms that they spend almost 8 hours a day on, they make Vance Packard's Hidden Persuaders look quaint. Because not only is the persuasive behavioral data that they're using and selling to advertisers one thing, they're actually designing these technologies so that it makes it increasingly difficult for any of us to put them down. They are designed to keep you hooked. So even though I completely agree that personal responsibility is absolutely vital, especially when we're talking about what parents can do for their children, let's not forget that we are, as consumers and as citizens in a free society, we should be pushing back on companies that create unethically designed devices, just like we would push back against the Ford Pinto or any other design that proved, harmful. So I'm the skunk. I'm always the skunk at the garden party at these things. I'm sorry. I wish I could leave you with some moment of hopefulness. Yeah, lots. So hopefully we can talk a little bit more about some of those technologies. Thanks.
All right, we're going to turn to our panel. I wonder if everyone would like a 2-minute break to go get a drink or something, and then we'll come back and have a conversation with all of our lovely panelists, and we'll go to audience questions too.
Sorry, I just went on a rant. Yeah.
Grab a seat. All right, so I want to thank our panelists again. I wanted to start by kind of asking this question of, what we as families can do about some of the challenges we've heard today, whether that is just an individual responsibility, whether it's doing something, regulate corporations, whether this is a government question. We sort of see the local community rise up model here. What do you think are kind of the best approaches to some of the challenges we've heard? I guess, maybe Brad, you want to start?
Well, I think one thing that we should be thinking about, too, is sort of the way in which this technology may be having different impacts on families and kids by class. And what I think about here, in part, is just sort of like the whole experience we've had with divorce and family instability in America. Because there was kind of like this big shift, obviously, in the 70s towards a much more kind of easy approach to divorce. And then it sort of affected everybody. But starting in the 80s, there were some scholars, some psychologists who were kind of conducting studies, raising alarms about family instability for kids. And kind of their findings, their scientific findings, their messages kind of began to percolate out in the broader public. But they really were most effective, I think, in reaching and motivating and persuading college-educated and more affluent Americans and parents about sort of the importance of marriage and the importance of family stability. And since then, we have seen a marked decline in family instability among college-educated Americans. Divorce is down, but particularly among college-educated parents. I think they've kind of gotten the message that marriage matters, that family stability matters for them and for their kids, and they're acting accordingly to an important extent. The problem, of course, is that same kind of message, those sort of same studies, that sort of same practical wisdom about family life did not kind of percolate kind of across the entire society. And so, I'm, of course, always beating the drum about marriage and families and arguing we've got to do more culturally, in part, to kind of bridge that divide. But I think we kind of could draw some same lessons about sort of technology. And, it does seem like technology may be, even now, somewhat more kind of problematic for kids in less educated homes. And we've seen, too, again, even kind of in stories in the New York Times about Silicon Valley, is that these sort of Silicon Valley elites are kind of recognizing now that this technology poses a threat to their own kids and their welfare to some extent. And they're taking measures in terms of limiting tech access to their kids to protect their kids from excessive exposure to screen culture. And I think that sort of same pattern could be kind of happening, across the broader society, where more educated, more affluent parents will become aware of the dangers of technology, and they will take measures for themselves and for their own kids to protect them. The problem, though, is that what's happening in our public schools, what's happening in communities where parents are not, for any number of reasons, as motivated or with it. And so I think that's why we have to think about solutions that go beyond just challenging parents to be responsible, but also challenging our companies and even the federal government and the states to sort of take measures that allow families and parents to do more, but also protect kids. So for instance, I've had kids in private school and in public school, and I'm just amazed how in Albemarle County, Virginia, there are very few regulations governing how kids use technology, and it's very distracting for my kids and other kids in the classroom. And so it'd be pretty easy, I think, for the county to kind of, and public schools more generally, to kind of take a more restrictive approach to protect the integrity of the classroom, attention, et cetera, for the kids in those classes.
Well, the cultural messages are actually the inverse of what they're supposed to be. If you listen to the messages that we are sending to poor and working class Americans, it's all about bridging the digital divide. Everything is, how can we get your kids and your family more access to technology? How can we put more computers and more iPads in libraries for your kids to use? How can we get more technology into the classroom? And what you see when you actually break down the data, you see that poor and minority kids are actually have higher rates of screen time than, because, we're restricting the screen time that our kids have. But these parents are actually think they're doing good things for their kids by giving them access to this technology. They're hearing the message that if you want your child to succeed academically and then economically after they finish school, the answer is this kind of access. So yeah, I think we need to completely reverse those cultural messages in some ways. And government is responsible for many of those cultural messages. If you listen to mayors, governors talking about the digital divide, talking about getting your kids more access, the people that they're talking to are ostensibly, poor and working class Americans, and they're using their bully pulpit to kind of try to push more of that into these homes, and I think it's a big problem to be able to change that. Even if we can change this cultural narrative, I think we've seen that this year. How do we change it across across economic divides? I think is a good question. So, Christine, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would just briefly add to that, actually. I know we are at AEI, and there's always interest in free market and market solutions. But those have been sort of the same reasons why technology has been so easily able to infiltrate our classrooms and reach young people. I went to public school, and I remember in elementary and middle school, we had a program where students were given iMacs, like the colorful clamshell ones. And they were a donation from Apple to the school system. And that's what got us started online. And that continues to influence, obviously, how children learn, what they're interested in, how they use technology for years to come. And that happened because it was an agreement between the government and a private company on the market, ostensibly to the school's benefit, but obviously as a marketing technique employed for the company. And yes, maybe it makes the school system some money. Maybe it makes them seem forward-thinking. Maybe we do want that private-public partnership. But I think we also need to be a bit more skeptical. We need to ask what the costs are, and we need to ask what the actual outcomes will be. Sure, Facebook is willing to sponsor a code-a-thon at your school, or Apple is going to donate computers to your district. Or even just training or materials that are given either for free or for a lower cost by these organizations. They are out to make money. They are out to push their product. And even if we are interested in those solutions, we need to push back at a certain point.
Well, and the disparity of resources available to, say, just parents in a school district who want to lobby a legislator compared to Google and Facebook and Amazon's lobbying budget in this town is insane. And you're right, and it's not just school districts, it's our own federal government uses Amazon's cloud computing systems. I mean, they're all in bed with these big tech companies, and you're right. I mean, I'm a conservative, pro-free market person, but for the first time in my adult life, I want to see regulation, and this is becoming bipartisan. Josh Hawley in the Senate, others have raised this issue of monopolistic power in the context of Facebook and Google. But the second order thing that I think is especially concerning for parents is the ethical questions, right? I mean, look, we ask doctors to take a Hippocratic oath, right? They have to vow to protect and do no harm. Why don't we ask the designers of technology to do no harm, or to at least think through what the ethical implications of what they're creating are? If an engineer designs a bridge and it collapses and harms people, there are consequences for that. We don't ask those same questions of our technologies, but they are part of our lives in a far more daily, momentary way than any of those other infrastructure that we take for granted. The other thing I will say, though, is because I'm conservative, I do believe in personal responsibility, and I think that especially for teenagers, parents have to educate them. And I mean, there's some things I've had to talk to my kids about that I really wish I didn't have to. I was like, maybe when you're 25, we could discuss this. No, you're 12, we have to have this conversation. But look, they ask questions about, online. You brought up online dating. I mean, Tinder is a slot machine for human lust. I mean, what else is it? It's just like, keep swiping, keep swiping. There's a way in which there's a dehumanizing effect of these technologies at just the age when kids are trying to figure out how to be a human in the world. So I think those are really important things that parents can control. But you're absolutely right. There's a higher level order of questions we should be asking of state, local governments, and of the federal government.
Brooke, I was wondering whether people are using the information about who else feels this way, that they see other people's names on the pledge, whether they're using that to make any kind of concerted effort to change school policies or local government policies, or it could be used that way.
Absolutely. It's definitely bringing communities of parents together on broader issues beyond just the smartphone. And parents have come together in these different communities and have challenged the way kids are using smartphones in the classroom, how they're using iPads or Chromebooks in the classrooms. And I think it's really been a great strength of the pledge because it is bringing these parents together that do have so many concerns. In our own local community, we've just recently have started to rally against how much these personal devices that the school has issued are having an impact on education. And it's just mind-boggling because we're basically in bed with Apple. We have sunk millions and millions and millions of dollars into these devices, and there's no going back. And the kids are on them constantly, and teachers rely on them so much, and we have no books anymore. And it's difficult. It's really hard to dig yourself out of this hole when we're so deep into this problem.
Well, I guess there has been something of a shift. It was interesting when I first started interviewing parents. I think there was a lot of this competition. I mean, people were actually looking at going to back to school night to see which shiny new toys their school was providing. And I think at least now there's been a lot of reporting on this. I think there's a lot more skepticism, how did these toys get in my kid's school? And is there any evidence that they're actually improving learning? I think those are two questions that parents are starting to ask more than they were, say, 5 years ago, when it was just kind of a look what we have and look what you don't have. But, so I wanted to sort of delve a little deeper into the how the screens are affecting relationships. I know, Christine, you've done a lot of research looking at how they can affect kind of our in-person interactions and reading social cues and things like that, and then sort of look at that, what that means for families.
So the research on the decay of face-to-face communication skills is fascinating and worrisome. We evolved over a great span of time to learn to read cues by looking at someone's face. To read micro expressions, to try to be able to tell if someone's either surprised, fearful, or about to kill you. Right? I mean, these are evolutionary strategies that have existed for a very long time, and I think that. Obviously technology expanded the range of our senses in wonderful ways. You can pick up the phone and talk to someone halfway around the world. You can now Skype with someone halfway around the world. These are not bad things. But especially for kids, when you spend most of your time interacting through a screen, there are detrimental effects. There was a wonderful researcher who unfortunately died far too young, Cliff Nass, out in California, who was doing a lot of research on children's face-to-face communication skills and looking at the data based on how much time they spent staring at screens versus in-person interactions and their sort of overall well-being. And not surprisingly, their well-being markers went down the more time they were dealing with screens. But you remove the screen and you put them face-to-face with their peers and learning these human cues, and they felt better after doing this for a while. So he had these small little controlled experiments, but he was doing a lot of really fascinating work about just what it means to be a human being who's hardwired to read a person's face, to tell if someone's getting bored and looking around, and all these cues that actually we're constantly reading, in the media about what Silicon Valley is trying to replicate with artificial intelligence, with robotics. I mean, they're trying to actually solve this problem of how we learn to do this. It's extremely complicated, which is a good thing. So I think that, again, this speaks to opportunity costs, right? And especially in the classroom, that one-on-one human interaction matters, but it can't be quantified in the same way that how many times did you click this box on this test to do that? So because it's unquantifiable, it's difficult to defend, but it's exactly the thing we should be defending, especially for our kids.
Brad, did you want to? The issue of face-to-face interaction in our families and how that affects, sort of children's development and.
Yeah, I mean, I would just
echo
just the point that Christine was making, and certainly Jean Twenge's work suggests that, the more time people are spending kind of doing kind of real physical things, even chores, the more they're outside, the more likely they are to be flourishing as teenagers. So there's a growing, although somewhat contested body of evidence just on this score. But I think kind of the sort of the bigger question here too is just sort of we are seeing kind of, if you kind of step back from the particulars of this debate about parenting and kids, we are seeing a pretty marked decline in fertility and marriage across much of the developed world. And we really don't know yet whether or not that's partly also related to sort of the quality of, or the allure of screen culture. And so it's kind of more of a question that I have, is sort of what role does sort of the rise of screen culture play in both declines in fertility and also in declines in marriage?
I was actually wondering that in one of your slides when you were talking about how there was no correlation between the quantity of time and the relationship quality.
In this one survey, yeah.
Do you think that people are just sitting in the same room on their phones, and so they're technically together?
Right. No, and this is one survey, so I mean, it may not always capture all the, the sort of the actual trends that we see in the broader society. So that's a question. But I guess we have seen in work done earlier by Robert Putnam at Harvard in his book Bowling Alone. He was trying to make sense of why was there such a dramatic decline in American civic engagement and community life in the last half century. And he was kind of looking at this question before the rise of the internet. And his conclusion was that TV actually had played an important role in making local associational life, making religious participation, making other kinds of community activities sort of less compelling, or less attractive relative to sort of the immediate appeal of watching television. And so, I mean, if Putnam was onto something there, it seems to me that, sort of standard issue TV from the 70s when I was growing up as a kid, doesn't even hold a candle to what we can now get on our smartphones and our small screens. And so it suggests then, and there has been some work done looking at sort of the implementation of broadband, that broadband does seem to be linked to declines in certain types of civic engagement as well. So anyways, the point I'm making here is that I think the question before us is sort of how much, again, does technology inhibit the cultivation of in-person activities, communities, and relationships in ways that, are going to be deleterious to us both individually and to us as a community and as a country.
I was thinking recently that my son was in a production of Bye Bye Birdie, and all the parents were talking about, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story, but all the parents were talking about how the kids in the play didn't understand what it meant to be going steady. There was like a whole song about going steady, and there are all these fourth and fifth graders who are singing at the top of their lungs about going steady and not a clue about what it meant. So, I mean, this is one possibility, is that this is sort of just another iteration in how we date. On the other hand, then I wonder, but is this is a big change? I mean, Christine, do you think your sister is going to, be able to go on a regular date after, swiping at Tinder at eating clubs? Do you think that? I mean, this is something I wonder about for my kids. When I tell my meet cute story with my husband, they look at me like, what are you possibly somebody's gonna call you and pick you up and take you and that you're gonna have a meet them and have a conversation first, and you're not gonna have this online thing helping you. I don't know what the future holds for this whole dating thing.
Right, yeah, this is still early stages, I would say, too, because many of these dating apps, especially these swipe-through apps, have developed over the past 5 years or less. And I think it's already, either this year or last year, it became more common to have married someone who you met online as opposed to someone who you met through friends. So they've appeared, but they are definitely not going away. And in fact, they're becoming more popular. But we don't have as much data yet because they haven't been here that long. That said, actually, sort of dating, marriage, and sexuality is another topic that I study and write on frequently. And there is a lot of evidence emerging anecdotally right now, and I think we're trying to do more real research on this too, as to how these dating apps change the way that, people view availability and opportunity costs in dating, and also what they themselves can achieve. So Christine was pointing out very accurately that apps like Tinder and Bumble, where you do swipe through tens, hundreds of faces, if you want to, really do contribute to this idea of feeling that, there's always the next person out there. You can judge someone just based on their face and maybe one or two words, and you'll probably find someone better. That means that people don't actually stop to have relationships. Like you said, it's not really a meet cute. You're not going to, spend time talking to somebody who you don't actually find that attractive because there's someone else. So this kind of eliminates the idea of perhaps someone who isn't as charming at first, wooing you and then allowing you to enter into what could be a fulfilling relationship. And this also begins to stratify, the kinds of people who can enter into relationships. If you're really attractive, if you have a lot of resources, you might go first. You might find relationships very easy to start, enter, or monopolize other people's time. Whereas people who don't have the same facility with these apps or with these resources will find themselves left out of the dating and marriage market. And that, I think, is a problem that is also being exacerbated by the availability of screens to entertain you in other spaces. So if you're one of those people who would have to work really hard to find a date, a young man, for instance, you could do that. Or you could just watch pornography on your phone and not date anyone at all. And that is something that we're seeing happen as technology becomes easier to use, as different forms of entertainment become cheaper and easier to find. It's that much easier for people to drop out. And that, I think, is something that is contributing to the decline of marriage, the decline of fertility, and it's something that is going to, I think, increase over time as our entertainments become more sophisticated. And that's a personal worry that I have, and that, I'm even seeing as a 30-year-old who lives in Washington, D.C. And I do think that's something to worry about.
Do you remember a few years ago when the movie Her came out, the one where he falls in love with his operating system? Everyone's like, oh, that would never happen. There was just a story out of Japan about a young man who married an avatar, a computer avatar, and when asked why he didn't date a real woman, he's like, well, there's so much trouble. Basically, that was in a nutshell. His response was like, she's just so accommodating. I'm like, oh my God. And it was just a few years ago that everyone was poo-pooing. They were like, oh, that's so dystopian, that would never happen. But
So, what do you both think what are you gonna tell your children about, like, what dating used to be like, and are you gonna encourage them to, call up, somebody of the opposite sex and say, hey, would you like to go out, or is this just a losing battle?
I feel like storytelling with your children is so important. So just even telling them about how you and your husband met or how your friends met, and just encouraging always people over screens and being intentional with conversations and kind of pushing them to engage with people off screens, I think is so important. All these little steps every day, they build character and they build who your children are going to be. So my hope would be, by being intentional every day with how they interact with other people, how they interact with technology, that will shape how they live their lives when they become teenagers and enter the dating world, et cetera.
Well, this might sound cynical, but the other thing that I think we have to teach young men and young women how to do better is to both dish out and accept rejection, because most of what goes on online is a form of rejection. And one of my sons, someone told him, said, oh, I have a crush on you. And I said, well, what are you going to do? And he's like, well, she's my friend, but I don't like her that way. I'm like, well, then you have to think through the conversation you're going to have with this person, because with her feelings in mind, not just yours. And that's actually something that has to be taught, right? Even if you have a naturally empathetic daughter or son, there's a kind of conversational way of rejecting people that's the absolute opposite. It's humane versus, it's analog versus the digital form, which is like click, ghosting, which everyone knows about, right? You can ghost someone. You can't do that in real life. You shouldn't do that in real life. You should, but these are all new rules, and they're a fairly recent vintage, I think.
I think I'd like to open it up to some questions from the audience. You've been a great audience. I appreciate it. And so if you wouldn't mind, I think we have a microphone. Just let us know your name, and please ask a question. Don't just make a statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stephen Balcom with the Family Online Safety Institute. Brooke, we're a big supporter of yours and what you're doing. I raise wait until 8th every time I do talks with parents.
Thank you.
One of the things, though, they do say and they say, yes, there's peer pressure for their elementary school kids and their middle school kids to get phones. And they accept that. But they also tell us we want to be able to get in touch with our kids, particularly with the rise in school shootings and everything else. we've been trying to advocate to them the idea of these new smartwatches that are coming through, like the Gizmo watch, where you can, it's a bit like Dick Tracy. I mean, you can call and make calls, you can text, but only to a very few numbers Is that something that you think might be a promising way to get parents to wait until 8th grade?
Yes. So the wait until 8th pledge is just for delaying smartphones. So we encourage parents who need to get in touch with their children before 8th grade for whatever the reason may be to consider either a two-way calling watch or a basic flip phone. And believe it or not, they are still out there. And companies are actually even starting to make them again, the ones that they had retired because it's kind of retro and cool. And there's a new phone coming out in a few months. It's called the Light Phone 2, and it's sleek, it's cool looking, it just calls and texts. There's no screen other than that. So we've been encouraging parents to really look at other options if they need to get in touch. Don't go straight to the fully loaded smartphone with all the bells and the whistles and the camera and the apps. If you need to get in touch, there's so many other options to consider. There's another device, too, out there that's relatively new. It's called the Relay by Republic Wireless, and it's basically like a fancy walkie-talkie that you can talk to with your kids, but it operates on the wireless network. And it's encouraging talking to each other and talking to your friends. And so I think the more that we can push parents into those lower tech options, the better, and they can still get in touch. And I would say on the note as far as like all the mass shootings, it's interesting because a lot of parents do say they want their child to be able to get in touch with them, so they get them the smartphone because of the safety reasons. But there was an NPR story about this where they interviewed safety experts and police, and they actually say it's more distracting in those situations to have the smartphone with you because you're too worried about either capturing what's going on or figuring out what's going on, that you could easily get tied up in a dangerous situation because you're not paying attention, which I thought was really interesting.
Very quick follow-up. When we talk to teachers, they complain to us that parents are always texting their kids during class time.
Absolutely.
So we have got to be better at being a good digital role model to our own children.
I absolutely agree.
I think that I just wanted to add to that, the interviews that I did with parents, I heard this a lot, this question of how I'm going to get in touch with my child. A lot of parents definitely acknowledge that they are texting their child regularly during the day. I was serving lunch at my child's school a few months ago, and this mother who was standing next to me, she kept getting all these texts from her daughter, and I said, is everything okay? This was the middle of the school day. And she said, oh, it's just so nice the way my daughter and I can communicate like this, and she's telling me about what's going on with her friends. And I was like, this is the middle of the day. Like, why, she could talk to her when she get home. But the other thing I wanted to say is that I think a lot of the parents who are using the phones to get in touch, are stifling a little bit of their children's independence. I mean, I think some of us need to maybe go back a little bit and figure out how we ever got, picked up from soccer practice without a smartphone. Mm-hmm. And the answer is we had this other thing, it's called a watch. And your mother said, I will meet you outside at 5:30. And, if you're not there, I will assume there's some kind of emergency. But, when my daughter started swimming on a team 3 years ago, I said, I'm not going to come into the locker room. I see the kids in the locker room. They're all texting their parents to come pick them up like their parents are Uber. I'll be out in 5 minutes. Be there in 5. And I said, I'll be outside at 7 o'clock. I expect you to be there at 7 o'clock. But also, like, the one time, I think my daughter forgot her swimsuit or something. And she had to go to the front desk at the YMCA and ask to use their phone to call me. And this was like an interaction that I think a lot of kids don't have anymore. There's a stranger, you have to ask them for something. It's a perfectly safe environment. There's no one there who's going to hurt you. But you have to ask them a favor, then you have to make a phone call, and you have to sort of take responsibility for this. I think a lot of we need to get in touch with them is all about making sure that everything goes perfectly smoothly and that they're never left in a situation where they might not know what to do.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think all of those moments add up and really teach your children how to navigate the world without you right by them side and without getting constant text. Should I get the blue or the red? Like, some things they just need to figure out on their own, and they're going to be okay. They're going to be better off for it by navigating without you constantly giving them direction.
Brandon Schulter, Christian Post, thank you for this discussion. What I often hear from parents is that they are they're just sent into a psychological tailspin in terms of how to parent. And as technology continues to develop so rapidly, they have to completely change the way they parent, even if there's a 3 or 4 year gap between their kids. What worked for one, even just a few years later, is they have to totally reorient themselves in terms of how they raise their kids, and it's because of the continuing development of technology. I guess what I'd like to know is what's coming down the pike and how can parents be ahead of the curve? I think the delay until 8th is a great way to sort of push back and respond to this thing, but technology is still developing and artificial intelligence is more and more of a thing, and there's other things that I think a lot of parents would like to know. How can I be ahead of the curve? And just sort of a second part to my question is, how useful do you think it is? I mean, I generally don't like to use fear as a motivator, but frankly, I can't think of anything more horrifying than a child accessing sex trafficking on the phone and vile pornography and then trying to act it out. Like there are real horrors here. It's not just about stunted psychological and social development. How might people talk about the real things perhaps as a way to deter smartphone usage, any kind of technology stuff? Just would appreciate thoughts on that.
An expert on the future.
You're all doomed if I'm the expert. No, I would say that you're going to see more real-time. Okay, first of all, don't buy an Echo or an Alexa or any of those things that's in your home. That's just a surveillance device that earns money for big tech. So just smash it to bits. Just no, don't put that in your home. Because, thank you. But also because your children's voices are recorded on there, your children's behaviors, things that because you'll forget it's on. There's not a lot of clarity on, is it always off or on? Do you control that? That's a little, they're squirrely about how much control you have over that. So I would say don't invite the Internet of Things, as it's called. Don't bring that into your home. You don't need a smart refrigerator to remind you to get milk. Like, just keep a list, you know? So some of the stuff that seems nifty, the Ring doorbell was the most recent one, right? Like the Amazon employees just like listening in on people's conversations, recording in the home, looking at the streaming of that. But a lot of these are conversations, like I said, you have to have them younger and younger. Then the recommendations now of pediatricians is that you have that conversation about porn. It's got to be like 5 or 6 years earlier than we all had it. I mean, I was the VHS era, and I do remember my parents sitting down, when we got our first VCR and saying, "Don't ever let your friends bring a tape over here unless we know what is on the tape." We're like, "What are they talking about?" And I do remember having a conversation. My dad, I was one of 3 daughters, and he sat us down when we were about to go off to college. He said, "Never let someone take a picture of you naked." I'm like, that's so stupid. Who would do that? Well, I mean, 5th graders are doing that. So these conversations, unfortunately, have to happen earlier, and they have to be, I think, for kids especially, based on human behavior, right? Kids are actually pretty good barometers of other people. They have a good spidey sense about the bad guys and the good guys, and they're very open-minded. So some of my kids, we're waiting maybe past 8th. They're one of the few 7th graders in their big DC public middle school who don't have smartphones, but they take the city bus to and from school. And there have been a few things on the city bus where someone harassed them. And I had to teach them the more difficult lesson of it's better to be safe than polite sometimes, right? They're taught to be polite to strangers. So these are all a million little lessons. The pornography one, though, is central, especially for boys. And I don't know, one approach I've heard people take successfully with kids who are now older is to tell them it's all made up. Like, it's acting. These people are being paid to do this. It's not. It looks real and it's meant to incite your lust, but it's not actually how people behave. And if you behave like this in real life, it's not going to go well for you. That conversation, I've had friends who've had that with their 8th and 9th graders.
I think it's scary because there are so many topics, from cyberbullying to kids taking their lives to the pornography to the sex trafficking, and you're having to have conversations with your children that you never thought that you would have to at such a young age. I have an 11-year-old and a 10-year-old and a 5 or 6-year-old now, and we have talked about suicide, and we have talked about sex trafficking, and we have talked about pornography, and what do you do in these situations where this happens on a screen? These are the steps you take. And I think when you take out all that awkwardness and you just dive right in and you talk to your kids about that, they're going to consider you an authority on that, and they're going to come to you when they have a question. What does this mean, Mom? What should I do about this? And it's not in this cloud of secretness and it being wrong for them to come to you. And I think that's the most important part for our children, to feel open to come to us regardless of the situation that they've encountered.
I would actually say, I was going to say, first off, exactly that Alexa and Echo and all of their friends and compatriots should not be in your house. I mean, they're becoming so common that, you know, their children whose first reported words now are Alexa. Like, that is happening. That is a thing. And it's weird and scary and inappropriate, and yet it's there. I think one of the things, the underlying themes here that we're seeing is that we use these devices, we use technology to make our own lives easier, right? To be able to reach our kid, to order the milk from our fridge somehow. I think we have to take a step back and make our lives harder on purpose. Like, you don't have an Alexa, that means that you have to go use the calculator yourself. You can't call your kid, or your kid can't call you. That means they have to figure out how to get on the bus. And that might be a little bit less convenient for you as a parent, or for your kid's friend who wants to call them, but, you know, that's probably good for them on some level. And with this question about, you know, talking about pornography or sex trafficking or the various things that happen online, yes, obviously, I think as a parent, it's an awkward conversation to have. Like, you'd rather not do it, but I also think that's probably your job as a parent to have those hard conversations. And I think right now, like, the age of first exposure to pornography is so young. It's like maybe under 10 years old, in fact.
It's 9.
So you've got to have those conversations soon and realistically. And you can do that at, you know, an age-appropriate level for your kids. And that can also involve just teaching them about bodily autonomy, and being open, yes, to talking to them about sexuality and education and whatever level that you're comfortable with. But you do have to choose to do that. And as an anecdote from my own sort of like young person life, you're right, the like dumb phones are coming back, and they're almost a little bit hip. And I have at least 2 friends who, somewhat frustratingly for our friend group, but ultimately a good thing, got rid of their smartphones and acquired from somewhere flip phones. And it's really annoying because to meet them, I have to call them and like find out where they are, or occasionally I'll be with them and they'll ask me to text someone for them because they cannot do it. But in the end, it's actually a good thing because, again, I'm forced to figure out where my friends are. I'm forced to call someone on the telephone. It enforces these conversations and these practices that we really need. You have to get over the hump, I think, of, you know, wanting to do the easiest thing and take charge of your lives and that of your kids.
Come right back.
Hi, I'm Katrin Kuiper. So when your kids do get a smartphone at 14 or 16 or whatever the case may be, what would be your recommendations in terms of how to usher them into that, how much to be involved and surveilling what they're doing, and how to, you know, grant them more privacy and independence before they go off to college and phase that in? Brooke, you mentioned that your group had developed some materials toward that effect, and I'd be interested to hear others' thoughts as well.
Well, we are in the process of doing some type of online curriculum that children could take with their families before they took that step of getting a smartphone. But I think it's really important to go through exactly what is appropriate and not appropriate, as far as also talking about what's safe, what's the right amount of time to be on these devices, all those conversations. And I think what happens a lot is that so many parents have this kind of one-off conversation where they rattle off a whole bunch of do's and don'ts and have their kids sign the smartphone contract, and they're like, check, that's done. And it has to be more than that. It has to be an ongoing conversation, multiple conversations over a span of time, and it's going to be hard at times, and it's not going to be just something that you do once or twice. And so I think it's just being intentional and going through all the different scenarios with your kiddos. And I'd also advocate just for not going from 0 to 60. I think it's important to slowly introduce the different aspects of a smartphone. So maybe at first it's just calling and texting and teaching them how to appropriately use the camera. And then eventually, like if they've been responsible, adding an app or two. I do strongly believe that kids are not ready for social media until they're at least 16, 17 years old. So I would advocate for holding off on social media until at least that point.
You could also use financial incentives or disincentives. I've had a few friends, especially for high schoolers who have like jobs or something where they have some of their own money, they have to pay for part of their phone plan. And the phone is the first thing taken away in the event of grades falling or misbehavior of any sort. But the monetary investment for a lot of those kids, I mean, they start to actually monitor their own use because they have skin in the game, as it were. So I agree about the contracts. The contracts are like the digital Sabbath. Remember when everyone's like, I'm taking a digital Sabbath? We're like, that's so healthy. That's so great. Well, but technology just kept steamrolling all of us. So a digital Sabbath is not enough. I think you're right. The contracts are more for the parents.
Yes, to say that they did it.
It's like, look, my kid has a contract. Like, but who's the enforcer of that contract?
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
you go into mediation if there's a dispute? Like, what's happening here? But I think the financial incentive is one. For older kids, I would say, like high schoolers, I have some friends who found that to be useful.
I think in terms of just the discussion about kind of parental responsibility, that we actually need to continue to think about ways in which both companies can do more to help us as parents, and also how government, in particular our schools, can do more to help us. So again, encouraging our schools to actually steer away from this turn towards high tech that you were talking about, and to rethink the importance of actual physical books versus having everything on a computer or some other kind of screen. And then when it comes to companies, having them sort of give us tools that allow us to control, there should be a kill switch for your home internet. You can just press on your smartphone that turns it off at 11 o'clock at night. And the same thing should be true for like the family phone plan. Like you can just turn your kids off, your kids' phones off at 11 o'clock. But I mean, there are sort of things you can do kind of individually, phone by phone, but the technology should be a lot easier for us as parents to sort of help kind of keep it all in check.
Yeah. I think the companies only recently kind of have realized how much of a market there is for that. I think when I first started researching the book, I got this sense, I talked to a lot of tech people who are like, the market's not there. You may think that you know a lot of parents who want this, but frankly, like, the internet wants to be free. So, we want everyone to have access all the time.
Right.
There's a lot of great products out there now that I think are really helping parents. There's one called Bark that monitors social media, texting, email, and it's all like linked up. So I think that's like one service that parents are using. With all the pressure on Apple, they've come out with a screen time feature that's on the phone that some of you may be using for your kids, but you can actually designate how much time you want them to be on it. It'll lock down at a certain point. So I think as time goes by, that companies are hopefully going to do more to help parents monitor.
And I do think that groups like Wait Until 8th can be really influential in schools and in public places. If there is interest from parents in controlling the screen time or usage of their kids at schools, that is something that you should be able to talk to your teachers about, talk to principals and superintendents about. As adults, for instance, if you go to a comedy show where a comedian is premiering new material, they will ask you to lock up your phone. You give them the phone and they will put it in a bag for X number of hours. And you agree to do that because that's the cost of entering the space. That is something that could happen at a school. If enough parents asked for this, I'm sure teachers would be willing to say, give me your phones at the beginning of class, I'll give them back when it's over. They would love to do that. But they have to have that parental support and pushing and backing. And that's something that I think it's pretty easy to lobby for.
Well, there's actually a product called Yonder that started for, I think, Dave Chappelle at comedian shows, but they're being used in the classroom, and it's basically like a little pouch that you put your smartphone in, and it's locked up for the day, and it can be unlocked in an emergency situation. But there's the Yonder pouch. There's also an organization called Away for the Day, and it was started by the woman that did Screenagers documentary, and the whole organization is to help equip parents to advocate for smartphone policies at schools and encourage schools to get phones away for the day during the classroom. So I think the more organizations like Away for the Day and Wait Till 8th that rise up and are encouraging parents to be advocates for their children, then that's going to start to change policies in schools as well.
Question over here.
Jim Sang. We started talking about screen time, but most of the discussion has been on mobile screen time. I'm old enough to be 72, so I'm in the grandparent stage. And I have to admit that one nice thing about the current environment is that something which dropped out of my life is now, when I was a kid or when I was a parent, is now back in my life as a grandparent, which is that we all live in a world where the kids have can't pass up assignments in Nagoya or a postdoc in Cambridge University that you'd be crazy to drop. And most of my friends play grandparent online. Some of them once or twice a day, some of them once a week. So there's this whole question of how the impact on children of screen time. There's the pornography, but there's also something that in the 50s and 60s, when you went to college, when you were from California, you went to school in Boston, you lost track of your grandparents and your parents, which now you can actually do again. So, it's the screen time and the screen time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's a lot of conversations where the tech companies will say, like with Facebook Messenger, they were advertising Facebook Messenger, and they were showing, I think maybe it was on the Today Show, one of the morning shows, the video they were showing was of a child, on FaceTime with a grandparent. And nobody objects to that. I mean, it's just this is I think the company was really sort of trying to get younger users to sign up so that they could form their own network. No parent was denying the child the ability to FaceTime with their grandparent. I have actually, my kids FaceTime with my parents sometimes, but we actually tend to use the phone more often now. Like I find they're actually more engaged in the conversation when they're not distracted by all of the things that they're trying to look at on the screen, but that's just us. But I do think, obviously, I think the technology has great benefits in terms of bringing people together who are geographically far apart.
But Facebook owns the picture of grandma. You don't own the picture of grandma. Just remember that. No, seriously, that is not your property. Once it's given over to that platform, it belongs to Facebook.
All right. We'll do one last question. I think there's a man in the back there who's waiting.
Thank you. Dylan Thomas from Fourth View Media. And I just want to thank Brooke again for mentioning Yonder. We're actually going to have an upcoming event at George Washington University, and we're talking with them on implementing it into the event to see if how college students react to tech being taken away from them. But just kind of as you're wrapping up...
have like trauma counselors on hand.
Yeah, well, we're hopefully going to have a Yonder representative being, there, so they're hopefully used to that. What are solutions from this point in regards to education in particular? I mean, what options do we have? I mean, should we have kind of the Department of Education has kind of a national standards and on education, and they barely mention technology or bullying, cyberbullying, or social media. Should we give more resources to like charter and private schools in order for them to be able to implement technology to the extent that they would like to? And are there even resources for parents and students to be able to go down the list and say, oh yeah, these public schools or private schools, they have like computers, but they're not laptops, or they're laptops, but they don't have computers. Like, what are kind of possible options? Thank you.
From my personal experience, I've tried to make a change at the district level. It is so hard to try to get anything done at the top level of your school district. And so what I have experienced is that if you want to make a change in your child's classroom, you really have to go to your school, to your child's principal, to your child's teacher, and advocate for your child there. So my kindergartner was coming home after about 10 days of rainy outside weather of indoor recess, and she was having magic school bus and iPad time. I'm like, what is going on? You're in kindergartner and you're getting extra 10 hours of screen time at school because it's raining outside. So I went to her teacher, and she's relatively new, and I just asked her, what do you need in your classroom to make indoor recess fun and creative? And she gave me a great Amazon wish list of mat formers and blocks and how to draw books and all these great resources that she didn't have. And so we shared that with our classroom. And now my child is playing on those resources instead of being on an iPad. So I think if you just advocate for those small changes, it's not going to fix the big problem. But that's one aspect that you can do to make a difference in education. I'm also partnering with the director of our curriculum in our school district to advocate for a parent list of books. So if I want to buy my child's school book instead of her reading on an iPad, then I would have that option to do it. And is that going to solve the problem long term? No, but is it going to make a difference in my child's education for this year or the next? Yes. So I think it's being creative in how to make a difference of where your child is at in their schooling.
Thank you all for coming out today. We really appreciate it, and I want to thank our panel. So.